So going over our medium salsa now, so things just got a little hotter, a little bit spicier, which means that it's a little bit more challenging. Okay, there's my flames. All right, a little bit more challenging. All right, so now we are looking at a few more number sense problems. So remember, number sense is taking everything that you know about numbers. And right now, what do we know about numbers? We know all sorts of numbers. We know decimal amounts, and we know about whole numbers. So we've learned a lot about numbers in 5th grade, and now we need to use that knowledge, okay? Also, using what we know about facts, so like the division is splitting, okay? Now, for all of these, huge suggestion, something we did in topic 6, was we estimated, right? We said, okay, let me just estimate, and that will tell me about where my decimal should go. So right away, you should see this and start to think, wait a minute, that looks kind of like 50 cents or 50 hundredths. Another way to think about 50 hundredths is a half, okay? And the way we've been looking at division is how many halves go into this. How many of these fit into this? So how many halves fit into this? Instead of calling it 63, let's call it something easier. Let's call it 60. So how many halves in 60 whole? Let's think about a half real quick. If this is one whole, what could this be? This could be one whole tray of lasagna, okay? If somebody cooks one whole tray of lasagna, how many halves in that? Here's a half, and here's a half. So one whole are 2 halves, right? So now we have 60 whole. So how many halves in 60 whole? Well, if one whole is 2 halves and 60 whole, I would double that and say that it's 120 halves. So now, go back to the problem. My estimate for how many halves are in 60 whole is 120. That's just an estimate. Now for the real problem, how many of these in 63 whole? Where would I put the decimal? If my estimate is 120, that looks like the right spot to me. Alright, the next one is a little weird. Really, again, using that number sense. How many of these fit into this? Okay, if I have 31 hundredths going into this, let's look at a different problem real quick. This is going to be a lot easier. If I said to you, how many 7s fit into 7, the answer would be 1, right? It goes in exactly 1 time. Now look at this. How many 31 hundredths fit into this? Well, it fits in almost the whole time, but not quite. It fits in a little bit less than once. If my estimate is that it's a little less than 1, where would you put the decimal? This makes it a little less than 1, so it would be 81 hundredths, okay? So this is tricky, and that's why this is on medium salsa. This is tricky, but if you ask yourself, how many of these go into this, it doesn't quite go in once, it goes in almost once, which is why I knew my answer was a smidge less than 1, which is why I knew the decimal went there. Okay? And then I have one more problem on this page. So this is a piece of plywood. Plywood's like, you can get a big piece of wood at like Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that. Okay, and this piece of wood happens to be 12 5/10 meters long. But we're cutting it into parts. Guys, whenever I think we're cutting it, I think we're splitting it, we're dividing it. So essentially, we're doing 12 5/10 divided by 65 hundredths. But good news for us is this says we can just estimate. So about how many pieces can be made? If they're each this big, how many of these will get made out of this? So, and back to my visual up here, if I'm cutting pieces that are just this big, how many pieces can I make? How many of these fit into this? But now let's estimate, okay? And I'll write my estimate in a different color. Well, I know we've been using this a lot, but can we just call this 50/100ths or a half? And how many halves would go in? Can we just call this 12, because that's a nice even number? How many halves go in 12? If you use what we talked about up here, how many halves go in 12? My estimate is about 24, which means that about 24 pieces can be cut. Okay? And then the last question on our mild salsa is, if this whole chunk of material costs $235, how much does each meter cost? So if this is the whole chunk, you're saying 235 and you're splitting it into the whole chunk, saying how many of these go into this, okay? So each meter, let's see, now they said we can estimate, so 235, let's just call it, well, let's call this 12, and what works well with 12? 24. How about 240 divided by 12? 24 divided by 12 is 2 with a 0. So I think each meter costs about $20. But let's just check that real quick. I want you to think about it. If the piece is 12 meters, 12 and change, let's just call it 12 meters, and each meter costs $20. So let's call this 1 meter. Let's split it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So I should have 12 sections. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And each meter costs $20. Let's see if that would work. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120, 130, 160, 180, 200, 240, 260. So my estimate is $260 that it would cost. So in my real problem, I don't just have 12 meters, I have 12 and 5/10 meters. And in my real problem, it costs $235. Does that sound about right? Sounds about right to me. Okay? Similar to one, guys, if you have trouble with any of these because they're fairly complicated, just ask. Don't be afraid to ask somebody for help because these are not easy. One video doesn't mean that you're an expert. Okay? If you're good with it, you can move on to the hot salsa.